All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel, and we try to tune you into some great theories of everything from the past, ancient and modern, and mainly pretty obscure things and esoteric things that maybe are a little bit difficult to approach and daunting to think about, but you know, we're not always going to figure out exactly what's going on, but we can usually get a pretty good ballpark estimate of what these different theories of everything are talking about. Theories of everything in grand unified theories, all-encompassing theories, tour de forces, and magnum opuses, and earth-shattering discoveries for you to help you with your paradigm shifting and your awakening to 5D consciousness and your formation of a holistic worldview, your quest for better spiritual, mental, and physical health. This is our 12th episode dealing with the book called The Dead Sea Scrolls Deception by Bajent and Lee. And this book came out in 1991. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in some caves in Qumran, 20 miles outside of Jerusalem in 1947. And more and more were discovered over the next 10 years. An international team of scholars was appointed. There was a lot of jurisdiction or possession issues that had to be resolved. They were discovered on the east side of the Dead Sea, which was in the Transjordan, but then eventually Israel acquired that property. Eventually Israel became a country, and then they acquired that. And so an international team, which was working in Amman, I believe, or East Jerusalem, they were appointed to study these scrolls, translate them, and put them out for the intellectuals, the academics, and the lay people as soon as possible. But it looks like the mostly Catholic priests that made up the international team found some stuff in there that they didn't like too much, maybe went up against their belief systems, and they started playing patty cake with the documents and translating them, but not sharing what they had found out with the rest of the general public, and doing a lot of kicking the can down the road, publishing stuff that's really not that important while ignoring the most important documents, and so on and so forth. At this point, they kept that up for over 40 years. And so at this point, we are in the late 1980s, and Robert Eisenman is a younger professor who's trying to open up these scrolls so that he gets access to them and other people get access to them. They're planning on kind of trying to set these people up legally. So Eisenman sent a letter to one of the Struniel, who is kind of like, at this point, after a few of the other leaders had died, he's kind of in charge of the international team, and he's requesting to be able to see some of the documents so that when he is formally declined, he can use that document as part of a legal proceeding, which I think is an international law court or possibly an Israeli law court. So he sent a letter to Struniel, and Struniel ignored it. But then eventually he said, oh, okay, I see it. You sent it to the wrong country, which wasn't true because he sent it to both Harvard and Jerusalem, both the places where Struniel operates. And we'll take over from there. According to the Biblical Archaeological Review, BAR, Struniel's imperious reply to Eisenman's request for access displays extraordinary intellectual hauteur and academic condescension. In it, he declares himself puzzled as to why Eisenman and Davies showed their letter to half the who's who of Israel. He accuses them of not having followed acceptable norms, in quotes, and refers to them as, quote, lotus eaters, which in Struniel's Mandarin presumably denotes Californians, though why this term should apply to Philip Davies at Sheffield is an open question. Struniel contrives not just to deny Eisenman and Davies' requests for access, but also to dodge each of the salient points they had raised. He advises them to take as their example the way such requests have been handled in the past and go through established channels, ignoring the fact that all such requests in the past had been denied. He also complains that the printout Eisenman and Davies had used to cite reference numbers of photographic negatives was old and out of date. He neglects to mention that this printout, not to mention any new one, had been unavailable to non-members of the international team until Eisenman put it into circulation. Eisenman responded to Struniel's brush-off by going as public as he possibly could. By the middle of 1989, the issue had become a cause célèbre in American and Israeli newspapers, and to a lesser degree was picked up by the British press as well. Eisenman was extensively and repeatedly quoted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Chicago Tribune, Time Magazine, and Canada's Maclean Magazine. He stressed 5 major points. 1, that all research on the Dead Sea Scrolls was being unfairly monopolized by a small enclave of scholars with vested interest and a biased orientation. Now, I did not mention at the beginning, these scrolls pertain to both the Old and New Testament, because the scrolls are Old Testament documents, and they are dated from somewhere between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD. And there's dispute about when they came out, but the documents are Old Testament copies or versions, and also a lot of sectarian material, which is the kind of inner workings of the sect at Qumran, that monastery at Qumran, or near Qumran, near those caves, where all of this stuff was printed up and stuff. And so not only do these have to do with the old Jewish texts of the Old Testament, but they also have to do, because they use a lot of very similar language to the language that's used in the Gospels especially. And so there's evidence out there that maybe these people influenced Jesus, or Jesus was one of them, or all kinds of different angles that people have. Okay. So his first point is all research on the scrolls were being monopolized by a small enclave of scholars. That 2, that only a small percentage of the Qumran material was finding its way into print, and that most of it was still being withheld. 3, that it was misleading to claim that the bulk of the so-called biblical text had been released, because the most important material consisted of the so-called sectarian texts, new texts never seen before, with a great bearing on the history and religious life of the 1st century. 4, that after 40 years, access to the scroll should be made available to all interested scholars. 5, that AMS carbon-14 tests monitored by independent laboratories and researchers should immediately be conducted on the Qumran documents. Okay, as was perhaps inevitable, once the media had begun to sensationalize it, the affair quickly degenerated, with Eisenman being misquoted on 2 separate occasions and a barrage of invective coming from both sides. But behind the clash of egos, the central issue remained unresolved, as Philip Davies had written in 1988. Any archaeologist or scholar who digs or finds a text but does not pass on what has been found deserves to be locked up as an enemy of science. After 40 years, we have neither a full and definitive report on the dig nor a full publication of the scrolls. End quote. And that's the end of chapter 4. Chapter 5 is called Academic Politics and Bureaucratic Inertia. Boy, I thought we were already talking about that, but this must be that more in spades. Early in 1989, Eisenman had been invited to present a paper at a conference on the scrolls to be held at the University of Groningen that summer. The organizer and chairman of the conference was the secretary of the journal Revue de Qumran, the official organ of the École Biblique, the French Dominican archaeological school in Jerusalem, of which most of the international team were members or associates. According to the arrangement, all papers presented at the conference would subsequently be published in the journal. By the time of the conference, however, Eisenman's conflict with the international team and the ensuing controversy had become public. It was not, of course, feasible to retract Eisenman's invitation. He was therefore allowed to present his paper, but its publication in Revue de Qumran was blocked. The chairman of the conference was deeply embarrassed, apologizing to Eisenman and explaining there was nothing he could do. His superiors, the editors of the journal, had insisted on excluding Eisenman's paper. Revue de Qumran had thus effectively revealed itself not as a non-partisan forum for the spectrum of scholarly opinion, but as a species of mouthpiece for the international team. The balance was, however, slowly beginning to tilt in Eisenman's favor. The New York Times, for example, had monitored the dispute throughout and had accessed the arguments of the opposing factions. On July 9th, 1989, it pronounced its judgment in an editorial entitled "The Vanity of Scholars." Quote, "Some works of scholarship, like the compilation of dictionaries, legitimately take a lifetime. But with others, the reasons for delay can be less lofty: greed for glory, pride, or just plain old sloth. Consider the sorry saga of the Dead Sea Scrolls, documents that might cast spectacular new light on the early history of Christianity and the doctrinal evolution of Judaism. The scrolls were discovered in 1947, but many that are in fragments remain unpublished. More than 40 years later, a coterie of dawdling scholars is still spinning out the work while the world waits and the precious pieces lapse into dust. Naturally, they refuse to let others see the material until it is safely published under their names. The publication schedule of J.T. Malik, a Frenchman responsible for more than 50 documents, is a source of particular frustration to other scholars. Archaeology is particularly vulnerable to scholars who gain control of materials and then refuse to publish them." End quote. Despite the unseemly squabbling, the clack and crack of ruptured amour propre, the fustian and umbrage, and General High Dudgeon, Eisenman's arguments were now beginning to carry weight, to convince people. And there was also another development of comparable importance. The outsiders, the adversaries of the international team, were beginning to organize, to consolidate their efforts and conduct conferences of their own. In the months following the editorial in the New York Times, there were to be 2 such conferences. The first of these was arranged by Professor Capero of Krakow, with the aid of Philip Davies, and took place at Mogilany, Poland. It produced what was known as the Mogilany Resolution, with 2 main demands: that the relevant authorities in Israel should obtain photographic plates of all unpublished scrolls, and that these should be supplied to Oxford University Press for immediate publication, and that the data obtained from DeVoe's excavation at Qumran between 1951 and 1956, much of which had not yet appeared, should now be issued in definitive published form. 7.5 months later, a second conference was convened on Eisenman's home territory, California State University at Long Beach. Papers were presented by a number of academics, including Eisenman himself, Professor Ludwig Koenen, and Professor David Noel Friedman from the University of Michigan, Professor Norman Golb from the University of Chicago, and Professor James M. Robinson of Claremont University, who had headed the team responsible for publishing the Nag Hammadi scrolls. 2 resolutions were produced. First, that a facsimile edition of all hitherto unpublished Qumran fragments should be issued immediately, a necessary first step in throwing the field open to scholars, irrespective of point of view or approach. And second, that a data bank of AMS carbon-14 results on known manuscripts should be established to facilitate the future dating of all previously undated texts and manuscripts, whether on papyrus, parchment, codex, or any other material. None of these resolutions, of course, either from Mogilany or from Long Beach, was in any sense legally binding. The academic community, however, and in the media, they carried considerable weight. Increasingly, the international team were finding themselves on the defensive. Furthermore, they were beginning, albeit slowly, to give way. Thus, for example, Malik, while the public battle raged, quietly passed over one text, the very text Eisenman and Davies had requested to see in their letter to Struniel, to Professor Joseph Baumgarten of Hebrew College in Baltimore. Baumgarten, of course, was now a member of the international team, characteristically refused to let anyone else see the text in question. Neither did Struniel, who as head of the team was supposed to authorize and supervise such transactions, bother to inform Eisenman or Davies of what had occurred. But the mere fact that Malik was handing over material at all reflected some progress, some sense that he felt sufficiently pressured to relinquish at least part of his private fiefdom, and with it some of the onus of responsibility. More promising still, Malik in 1990 surrendered a second text, this time to Professor James Vanderkam of North Carolina State University. Vanderkam, in a break with the international team's tradition, promptly offered access to other scholars. Quote, "I will show the photographs to anyone who is interested in seeing them," he announced. Malik, not surprisingly, described Vanderkam's behavior as irresponsible. Vanderkam then withdrew his offer. An important role in the campaign to obtain access to the Dead Sea Scrolls was, as we have already indicated, played by Herschel Shank's journal, Biblical Archaeological Review. It was BAR that fired the opening salvo of the current media campaign when in 1985 it published a long and hard-hitting article on the delays in releasing the Qumran material. When Eisenman obtained a copy of the computer printout listing all the fragments in the international team's possession, he leaked this document to BAR. He thus furnished BAR with an invaluable with invaluable ammunition. In return, BAR was only too eager to provide publicity and an open forum. As we have also noted, however, BAR's attack, at least in part, was directed at the Israeli government, whom it held as responsible for the delays as the international team themselves. Eisenman was careful to distance himself from BAR's position in this respect. To attack the Israeli government, he felt, was simply to divert attention from the real problem, the withholding of information. Despite this initial difference of opinion, however, BAR's contribution has been immense. Since the spring of 1989, in particular, the magazine has sustained a relentless, nonstop barrage of articles directed at the delays and deficiencies of Qumran scholarship and research. BAR's basic position is that, in the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls are public treasures. As for the international team, the team of editors has now become more an obstacle to publication than a source of information. BAR has, in general, pulled a very few punches, and indeed often comes very close to the legal limits of what can be printed. And while Eisenman may not have shared BAR's eagerness to attack the Israeli government, there's no question that those attacks have helped to produce at least some results. Thus, for example, the Israeli authorities were persuaded to assume some measure of authority over the unpublished Qumran material. In April 1989, the Israeli Archaeological Council appointed a scroll oversight committee to supervise the publication of all Qumran texts and ensure that the members of the international team were indeed fulfilling their assigned tasks. In the beginning, the creation of this committee may have been something of a cosmetic exercise, intended merely to convey the impression that something constructive was being done. In practice, however, as the international team have continued to drag their feet, the committee has assumed more and more power. As we have noted, Father Benoit's timetable, according to which the whole of the Qumran material would be published by 1993, was superseded by Struniel's new and theoretically at least more realistic timetable with a deadline of 1996. Eisenman had remained profoundly skeptical of the team's intentions. BAR was more vociferous. The suggested timetable, the magazine proclaimed, was a hoax and a fraud. It was not signed, BAR pointed out. It technically bound no one to anything. It made no provision whatever for progress reports or proof that the international team were actually doing their jobs. What would happen, BAR asked, if the Israeli Department of Antiquities, if the stipulated deadlines were not met? BAR asked the Israeli Department of Antiquities if the stipulated deadlines were not met. The Department of Antiquities did not reply directly to this query. But on the 1st of July, 1989, in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, Amir Drori, the department's director, issued what might be construed as a nebulous threat. Quote, "For the first time, we have a plan, and if someone does not complete his work on time, we have the right to deliver the scrolls to someone else." Struniel himself, however, in an interview with the International Herald Tribune, made clear how lightly he took such threats. Quote, "We are not running a railroad," he said, and in an interview with ABC television, he was even more explicit. Quote, "If I don't meet the deadline by 1 or 2 years, I won't worry at all." Malik, in the meantime, remained, as Time magazine put it, elusive, although the magazine did manage to extract one characteristically arrogant statement from him. Quote, "The world will see the manuscripts when I have done the necessary work." Justifiably unappeased, BAR continued its campaign. In the ABC television interview, Struniel, with somewhat lumbering humor and manifest contempt, had complained of the recent attacks to which he and his colleagues had been subjected. Quote, "It seems we've acquired a bunch of fleas," he said, "who are in the business of annoying us." BAR promptly ran a signally unflattering photograph of Professor Struniel surrounded by named fleas. In addition to Eisenman and Davis, the named fleas included Professor Joseph Fitzmyer of Catholic University, David Noel Friedman of University of Michigan, Dieter Georgi of the University of Frankfurt, Norman Gold of the University of Chicago, Z.J. Capera of Krakow, Philip King of Boston College, T.H. Gaster and Morton Smith of Columbia, Giza Vermes of Oxford. BAR invited all other biblical scholars who wished to be named publicly as fleas to write in. This invitation elicited a stream of letters, including one from Professor Jacob Neusner of the University for Advanced Study at Princeton, author of a number of important works on the origin of Judaism and the formative years of Christianity. Speaking of the international team's work, Professor Neusner described the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship as a monumental failure, which he attributed to arrogance and self-importance. By autumn of 1989, we had already begun to research this book, and in the process became embroiled, at least quietly, in the controversy. On a trip to Israel to gather material and interview a number of scholars, Michael Bagent decided to check on the so-called Oversight Committee, recently formed to supervise the work of the international team. In theory, the committee might be anything. On the one hand, it might be a paper tiger, a means of formally institutionalizing official inaction. On the other, it might offer a real possibility of power being taken from the international team and placed in more assiduous hands. Would the committee merely serve to cosmeticize further delays, or did it possess both the authority and the will to do something constructive about the existing situation? Among the individuals making up the committee were two members of the Israeli Department of Antiquities, Amir Drori, the department's head, and Ms. Ayala Sussman. Bagent had arranged initially to speak with Drori on his arrival at the Department of Antiquities. However, he was urged to speak instead with Sussman, who presided over the sub-department in charge of the Qumran texts themselves. Drori, in other words, had a number of matters on his plate. Mrs. Sussman's activities were focused more specifically on the scrolls. The meeting with Mrs. Sussman took place on November 7th, 1989. She clearly and perhaps understandably regarded it as an unwelcome intrusion on her already busy schedule. While being scrupulously polite, she was also therefore impatient, dismissive, and vague, vouchsafing few details, endeavoring to get the conversation over with as soon as possible. Bagent was also, of course, polite, but it proved necessary for him to become tiresomely insistent, conveying the impression that he was prepared to wait in the office all day unless some answers to his queries were forthcoming. Eventually, Mrs. Sussman capitulated. Bagent's first questions concerned the formation and purposes of the Oversight Committee. Mrs. Sussman, at this point, apparently regarding her interviewer not as a researcher with some background in the subject, but as a casual journalist skating on the surface of a story, imprudently confided that the committee had been formed to deflect criticism from the Department of Antiquities. In effect, Bagent was given the impression that the committee had no real interest in the scrolls themselves, but was merely a species of bureaucratic screen. What was its nominally official role, Bagent asked, and how much actual authority did it exercise? Mrs. Sussman remained vague. The committee's job, she said, was to advise. Amir Drori, director of the Department of Antiquities, in his dealings with Professor Struniel, chief editor for any publication of Qumran material. The committee intended, she added, to work closely with Struniel, Cross, and other members of the international team towards whom the Department of Antiquities felt an obligation. Some, she declared, have gone very far with their work, and we do not want to take it away from them. What about BAR's suggestion? Bajent asked, and the resolution adopted by the convention at Mogilani 2 months before, of making facsimiles or photographs available to all interested scholars. Mrs. Sussman's gesture was that of a woman dropping an irrelevant letter into a wastepaper basket. No one discussed it seriously, she said. On the other hand, and somewhat more reassuringly, she stated that the new timetable, according to which all Qumran documents would be published by 1996, was correct. We can reassign, she stressed, if, for example, Malik doesn't meet the dates. Every text in Malik's possession, she emphasized, had been allocated a publication date in the schedule. At the same time, she had not acknowledged her sympathy for Strunyel's position. Her husband, she revealed, a professor of Talmudic studies, was helping Strunyel on the translation, all 121 lines of it, of the long-delayed MMT document. So far as Mrs. Sussman was concerned, everything on the whole seemed to be in order and proceeding acceptably. Her chief preoccupation, however, seemed to be less the Qumran material itself than the adverse publicity directed at the Department of Antiquities. This profoundly disturbed her. The scrolls, after all, were not our job. Why is it causing trouble? She asked, almost plaintively. We have other, more important things to do. Bajent, needless to say, left the meeting disquieted. It is accepted wisdom in Israel that if one wishes to bury a subject, one creates a committee to study it. And as a matter of historical fact, every previous official attempt to oversee the work of the international team had been circumvented by DeVoe and Benoit. Was there any reason to suppose the situation would change? Okay, we're going to stop right there, and we will continue on tomorrow when we return. And so I hope to see you there. Thanks for tuning in today, and have